Hello and welcome to episode 3 of Unhallowed. I'm your host, Patrick McFarlane, joined by my co-host, Lizzie McFarlane.
Good evening, everybody.
And the show notes for this episode may be found on our website at unhallowedpodcast.com/3 for the episode number, episode 3. Correspondingly, this is also part 2 of the Castle of Otranto, our coverage of it at least. And this is the final part, covering, I think we left off somewhere in chapter 3. So we'll be covering chapter 3, 4, and 5. And we're really looking forward to it. We hope you enjoyed the first episode. And where did we leave off last episode?
Well, first, you mansplained to me the author's name.
And I was wrong.
And you were wrong. I want to point that out.
I mansplained it?
No, but I suppose I was correct saying Walpole. So that's why I always feel like saying Walpole, because that's his name.
I've bungled pronunciation so far on this podcast. Yep.
Par for the course.
Par for the course.
All right. So I think some of the last things that we were talking about was when Theodore and Isabella met in the cave. A little bit after this, they have a discussion, and he tells her that he will protect her from everyone that is out to find her, which is all of Manfred's men, and also the knights are looking for her.
There's some pretty romantic language when Theodore first meets Isabella.
When they're in the basement of the castle? Yeah.
Well, they're first, but also when he sees her again in the caves.
Yes. It's some of the dialogue with Theodore and his love interests, which would be Isabella and Matilda, is quite beautiful and very over the top. In the last episode, we ended sort of talking about how I was reminded a little bit of the soap opera aspects of this work, and it definitely has that soap opera quality with betrayal and twists and, a father coming out of nowhere and death and lots of romance. So there is a soap opera storyline kind of thing to it, I would say.
Well, there's a lot of these dramatic twists, and one thing I wanted to highlight too in this episode was the dead hand of the past coming back, the sins of the father revisited on the sons or the children. Those are some things that we can explore. Another thought that I had was this idea of Theodore keeps meeting Isabel in these feminine spaces, like a cave being a feminine space.
Oh.
Yeah.
And the basement with a trap door.
Yep. And some of these gothic aspects of it's just dripping with it. I mean,
ew.
Not to get all gross or anything, but Isabel's going through these cloisters and going through the dark space underneath the castle, and the wind is blowing her candle out, and there's these moonbeams that are revealing secret passageways, and they meet in the cave, and there's giant suits of armor that are traipsing around. It's just interesting. So
I think, you were going to say?
Well, I was going to say, so Theodore meets Isabel. He professes his love to her.
No.
Doesn't he? No, he pledges himself to protect her.
Yeah, he pledges his love to Matilda.
When he meets Isabella
Yeah,
in the
he
cave?
talks about how much he loves Matilda.
Oh, but then doesn't he pledge himself to Isabella? To protect her.
To protect her.
Yeah.
And this is a huge reveal at this point, because not only does Isabella find that Theodore loves Matilda, but also one of the knights discovers them. Theodore goes into attack and quickly mortally wounds the knight. And this is like the head knight of the trio that came to the castle. And as he takes his helmet off and he's bleeding, they find out that the man is actually, oh gosh.
He's Isabella's father.
It's Isabella's dad. And
Frederick, right?
Frederick?
Yeah.
I don't know. It's an F name. And so he comes and, he's sitting there bleeding, and they take him, Theodore feels terribly. They take him back to the castle, and they all gather together in the room with him. So Hippolyta, Isabella, and Matilda, and then Manfred comes in, and Father Jerome, and everybody, and all the characters are all together.
Well, and then all of a sudden it's like, oh, just kidding. Frederick wasn't mortally wounded.
Well, I think he was, but he kind of came back, or I don't think he was like magically healed or
It's
anything.
Like Days of Our Lives.
I was in a
sands
coma.
through the hourglass.
I was in a coma, but now I'm totally fine. And during this part,
By the way, I'm horny for your daughter.
Yeah. All of a sudden he decides that he is like obsessed with Matilda too. And so it's just, there's a lot of, I found myself thinking about the love triangle of, in Twilight during this a little bit, just with the whole, the girl and the two boys, Bella and the vampire and the werewolf, and just how sort of this is like a reverse, with Theodore being the Bella character, and then the two girls finding that they both love him, and then basically having like a truce. But I think it's a sweet moment where Matilda, and another one of those sweet, like feminine moments where it's just them together, and they have a conversation basically saying that they still love each other, even though and their friendship is the most important thing, even though that they both love Theodore. So
how wholesome.
I don't know. It's cute. I like it.
I would.
I don't know. I just think it's nice. I found myself thinking a lot about the story in the way that, even though it seems really it seems like it goes really fast once you're getting to the end.
Well, I was looking at this quote here because we were talking when the scene in the cave happens in these feminine spaces. It made me think of a quote from the introduction of this Oxford Companion, or the Cambridge Companion to Gothic fiction, where it puts it in no uncertain terms, because the whole daughter swap situation. There's a great deal of like incest that comes to play here too. This idea of forbidden relationships, and how Manfred all of a sudden lusts after his would-be daughter-in-law. Well,
also that he raised us from like her birth, basically.
Right. Well, and the fact that he discovers that Hippolyta is related to him in some schemy kind of way. But it's not, in medieval times, it wasn't too unusual for families to interbreed.
No, actually, they preferred it because it kept the blood pure. And a lot of royalty has aspects of physical or mental health issues, or even deformity, because of marrying close to your bloodline. And I'm so glad that that's not super common anymore, because that's so, I don't know, just growing up with somebody that's that close to you and then you're expected to marry them. It's just so awkward.
Here's a passage talking about these in-between spaces to bring some Gothic element into it, this idea of the in-between spaces. But the book has to say, even as early as the Castle of Otranto, and certainly in Walpole,
Thanks.
Walpole's Gothic play The Mysterious Mother. Women are the figures most fearfully trapped between contradictory pressures and impulses. It is Otranto's Isabella who first finds herself in what has since become the most classic Gothic circumstance, caught in a, quote, labyrinth of darkness full of, quote, cloisters, underground, and anxiously hesitant about what course to take there, fearing the pursuit of a domineering and lascivious patriarch who wants to use her womb as a repository for seed that may help him preserve his property and wealth on the one hand, yet worried that fleeing in an opposite direction, she is still, quote, within reach of somebody male, she knew not whom. It's just interesting the way that the author chooses to phrase her as being a repository for Manfred's seed.
Ugh.
Yeah. Uncomfortable episode.
Yeah, this is going a way that I wasn't expecting.
It's pretty, but it's prominent. It's pretty prominent in the story. It's all kind of related along this. I guess it's underlying the uncomfortability of the circumstance. Is that
Right.
There's such a rapey vibe here.
Well, isn't that part of the reason why she ran? I guess I didn't think about the physicality of it, that she runs from him when he first approaches her about this. Like he's going to attack her. And, and then he sends all these men after her and he tries to lock her up in a room. I mean, I guess it is a lot about force and just all of this deciding on what's going to happen to these women is so sad. And I think it's even in the same scene that I referred to earlier where the two girls speak about their love and their friendship for each other. Hippolyta comes in and they have a moment of, reconnecting. And then Matilda is like, I love you like a mother, Hippolyta, and I have to tell you what Manfred is planning. Or Isabella says that, I love you like a mother, because obviously Hippolyta is Matilda's mother, but Isabella's saying to Hippolyta that she loves her like a mother and that she raised her and she has to tell her Manfred's evil plan. And Hippolyta's basically like, stop. Like, I don't even want to hear it. Like, they are the men in charge of us. They're our husbands and masters. And I have to trust that they're good men and that they're going to do what's right. And it's just so sad, especially because they're so nice and they just, do you know where I'm trying to go?
Yeah.
Anyway, but.
Well, when does this scene occur? When is it right after they bargain for each other's daughter? Or is it earlier?
It's sort of happening concurrently in the story, but it's kind of like right after, and they're talking about how they're going to basically marry each other's daughters and they're all going to get what they want. And Manfred is kind of banking that this other guy's going to just sort of forget that the whole reason why the knight and his men came in the first place was to save Isabella from where she was and to take her back and to, save her from this life is where she was living, even though she was a princess.
And how does Frederick find out that Isabella is in dire straits? Does Jerome send out emissaries?
He actually, it has to do with that whole hand of the past thing that we were talking about. He actually has a vision, and when he's in the Holy Land, he has a vision where he goes and finds the sword, and there's a passage written on the sword, and it inspires him to go save his daughter.
Oh, don't they dig up this giant sword that they find in the desert?
Yeah.
It adds to kind of the absurdity of the whole situation.
Yeah, exactly.
And, yeah.
Yep. So that's why he comes so he brings his knights and all of his men and everything to the castle and confronts Manfred and says, you are not the the true heir to this principality.
Right, because it was the it was the grandfather of Manfred who usurped the royalty back a generation or two ago.
I think it was Alfonso that he ended up, I think Manfred's ancestor was a servant to Alfonso. And so he gives him the power because there's nobody else. But it ends up that Theodore's actually Alfonso's heir. And edging into the next part of the story, I guess it happens around the same time too. Manfred comes in and he sees, when they're all gathered together in that room, and he sees Theodore there in the suit of armor, and he believes him to be a ghost, the ghost of Alfonso. And he's like, it's a specter. And he said, don't you all see him? And they're like, what are you talking about? It's just Theodore. He's here. We all see him. He's just a real dude. It's the young peasant that you were upset at before, which makes me think, how different did this guy look? But he bears this resemblance to Alfonso. They reference a couple times how Matilda's like in love with this portrait, which kind of made me like think and reflect a little bit on the portrait of Dorian Gray slightly, even though it's not a very similar story at all.
I think, though, that in some way it is similar, and I haven't read it in quite some time, but isn't it the portrait of Dorian? And we'll cover this for sure on the show eventually, but isn't it that as Dorian Gray becomes more conceited, his portrait starts to change? Is that... Well, we'll get there. Time. Remember, we're not experts on this field, so we'll always pull that card out when we're unsure something.
It's an easy out.
But it just makes me think of this question I had about Manfred, is that, well, is he uncanny? Is he some kind of human monstrosity that is part human and part something?
I almost would agree that he is such a... I mean, he does have his reasons and his rationalizations that you can connect to in some sort of way. But there's also a villain side to him and his choices that is almost unreal.
Yeah. In the rationalizations that you're referring to, I think at some point he's listening to Theodore, and I think it's when Jerome initially reveals himself, he's listening to Theodore, and he has this kind of moment of clarity where he realizes that he's being a jerk, and he realizes that he's being a tyrant, so he has this self-reflection, and then he's like, wait, no, my loins.
Right.
So
I need someone to protect
my legacy. Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, in a certain way, I mean, it is very Shakespearean. It's very Macbeth. His own hubris is what ends up being his undoing.
Absolutely. I think that's a good point. And then there's the castle and the ghosts, and, there are a few parts to it that reflect.
Oh, that's similar. Like in Hamlet, too, where the ghost appears 3 times, I think, right? And there's the specter. There's 3 major appearances of supernatural design in the Castle of Otranto, and I think that was supposed to mirror... I read that it was supposed to mirror Hamlet.
I can see that.
Yeah.
I definitely picked up on that a little bit. I was almost waiting for there to be more things. Some
kind of a poisoning, perhaps.
Well, maybe.
Yeah. Well, so what happens then after... So there's the fight scene between Frederick and Theodore, and the whole unfortunate kind of soap opera-y element of that fight is that it's all futile, because actually they had the same goal, which was to protect Isabella. And it was just a confusion because Frederick thought that Theodore was the abductor, and Theodore thought that Frederick and... Was there another knight, or was it just Frederick?
There were 3 knights.
that came to the cave.
No, only one knight came. They had all spread out looking for her.
Yeah, okay. And that's what I had thought. And it just so happens by providence that Frederick is the one who finds and comes across Isabella and Theodore. So they go up and there's this discussion. And what is resolved? How does the discussion end? And we go to the next portion of the story.
I think they all kind of spread out to their own room sort of thing. And Isabella basically says, you know, I love you, Matilda, and I'll let you have Theodore. And then Manfred kind of goes back and forth into the knight's room saying, basically trying to convince him to do this trade. And Father Jerome takes Theodore to the church. And I think that the kind of one of the things that I just jumped to in the next, as one of the next major plot points, is how Matilda realizes that she's probably going to get married away to this guy. And she admits to her mother that she will do what her mother says, do what her father says. She'll obey her parents, and she resigns herself to her fate. But then she goes off into the church with Theodore, and they have this, you know, beautiful moment of telling each other they love each other, basically. And at this time, Manfred has been having Bianca, the domestic, Isabella's domestic, kind of spy. And he somehow finds out that they're in the church, and he thinks it's Isabella with Theodore. He doesn't think it's Matilda. And he goes in and he stabs Matilda. And she is basically dying. And everybody's just in a state, and everyone's like freaking out. And what a crazy end to it all, of basically everybody, it all getting like tied up in a little nice bow, even though people like aren't happy. And instead, what happens? She just gets killed by her own father. And so then he loses both of his children.
Sins of the father revisited upon.
Right. And then after that, I guess in the very end, Hippolyta and Manfred both join the church. They become like nuns. Well, he doesn't become a nun.
Yeah. Which is what Jerome basically did.
Right. Which is, yeah, that's true. And then not Alfonso, but I guess that's
well, then Theodore reclaims his rightful place.
Right. But he was looked like Alfonso. So I guess that's kind of like a slip of the tongue that makes sense.
Mm-hmm.
And then he marries Isabella and basically says that
I'll never love anyone like I love Matilda, but I guess you'll do.
You'll do, because we can talk about how awesome Matilda was together.
Right.
Because we both loved her so much. And it's just, I mean, it seriously, she dies and everything, Matilda dies and everything gets wrapped up in a page.
Yeah. And I thought that, you know, I think I commented on this in the first episode, but it just seems like this isn't very good writing by modern standards because it's all expositional mostly. It seems kind of that way, like in the first few pages and throughout the book, there's a lot of this very dense explaining of different relations and who's related to whom. And maybe that's why it's a little been a little hard for me to recall in this episode exactly how things are related, because not that it was particularly hard to follow, it was just kind of dry and not as memorable. But it's my understanding that people ate this up back like...
Oh, it was... Yeah, it became incredibly popular, especially for women.
Yeah.
And I don't know, I just felt like it built up all of these pieces. And like you were saying, the connections and the relationships. And it got to this pinnacle and this climax, and then it just shot down, just tumbled down.
Yeah.
And the ending it just felt like it was so fast that I almost was confused. Like, is it over?
Kind of like our episodes, like in this one, all like we just went through, and that's how the story is that it's just, there's a lot of build up and there's kind of a lot of plot in the middle, and then all of a sudden it just comes tumbling out.
And it's just over.
Yeah. And it would have been maybe more interesting if there was an ending that ended up being like an ambiguous cliffhanger. Because you get the nice bow that everything's tied up in with this ending, but none of it's satisfying.
No, definitely. I mean, the fact that I guess Isabella gets her man in the end could be satisfying if you were a big Isabella fan. And Theodore gets his castle and his kingdom. And I guess Manfred kind of gets his just rewards in a way because he loses all of his heirs. His entire thing is to produce these heirs that are going to secure his kingdom for him, and he loses all of them. And then, I don't know, everyone just kind of ends up being a loser, losing in this ending, and it's just...
Yeah, and Theodore doesn't deserve, I don't think, to lose Matilda. Can you think of anything he did in the story that, I mean...
No, I think that really it would have been nice. I guess it goes into that whole dramatic and sad. Oh, that's not.
Well, it's a Gothic story. It's not a romance.
I guess.
Yeah.
That they don't get what they want, and it's sort of just this moody, terrible ending.
Would you call it a tragedy? I mean, because I guess in a way. But it's a tragedy and comedy. And maybe
it's a dramedy.
That's kind of what Walpole was going for. Wadpole. That's it seems like that's kind of what he was going for, was this blending of the two kinds of romance that we talked about in the first.
Yeah. And now that it's over and that we've kind of thought about that and sat with that, I can definitely see that. And I don't know. Even though there are definitely critiques, and as English majors, I think that you are taught to have critiques. You're taught to try to close read and then start to pick things apart. But if we were to kind of step back...
It's called being a cynic, honey.
Well, maybe I'm both.
No, I'm teasing. I'm just kidding. There's like that episode of South Park where it's like, oh, you're just a cynical asshole. It's called being a cynical asshole. Well, there goes our family-friendly podcast.
I'm not going to say it.
It's okay.
So if we're just going to step back and look at the story as a whole, I would recommend reading it. I enjoyed reading it, even though maybe it took me a couple pages to sort of get into the prose, just because I feel like a lot of modern reading is easily digestible, just like a lot of our media is. It's easy to watch. The story's simple and easy in and easy out, and it's not difficult. And so sometimes when I choose to read something that's a little bit out of my norm, it takes me a page or two to just really, kind of bury yourself into it and really think about it a different way and challenge yourself a little bit with it. And so I'm excited for the next things that we're going to encounter. But I would say I would give this 3.5, 4 stars.
Out of 5.
Okay, 3.5 stars.
I mean, I would agree. I would agree with that rating. I did enjoy it, but I want to make a few comments on how it seemed like people were so much more literate and intelligent back then. And maybe not literate, because I'm sure literacy rates are much higher now than they were then. But of the people who are literate, it seemed much more, because at the time this was considered trash fiction in a way. Like, I don't know, like a Daniel Steele romance book or something. Because
something you'd get at the checkout at the grocery store.
Yeah, and it's interesting because we would consider, in a lot of people, especially in the Cambridge Companion to Gothic Fiction that we're reading, it's just that literary critics have always waffled on Gothic fiction as a genre in of itself, because they want to call it literature, but at the same time, it was always dismissed as being trashy, kind of in the way that Robert Bloch's Psycho was considered like a dime novel. But it's turned into, when Hitchcock picked it up, it turned it into like a work of high art in a way. But one of the other critiques that I had of it was that the characters, they don't change or progress at all. And they don't seem very complicated. Like Matilda's the damsel in distress, and Manfred he's a little complicated by the fact he's a little self-aware of his own tyranny. Hippolyta is just a doormat, and she doesn't really change at all. And Isabel, who is Isabel? Theodore's the hero.
Yeah, I would say that Isabella is the damsel in distress, and Matilda is sort of a shadow or a foil of her in a way, or maybe they're just two halves of the character, not even whole characters on their own right, perhaps.
Yeah, I didn't even really see them as different. I didn't picture them as different in my head. And the Bianca and what did you call them? The domestics.
Mm-hmm.
They're the comic relief, and Jerome, is he kind of like the friar from Romeo and Juliet?
Yeah.
And those interesting parallels there. But yeah, I mean, the characters didn't really, I don't know, they weren't very three-dimensional. There wasn't like a change that really occurred too much, except this Manfred meeting his own demise in a way. And I always I wanted to pose this question to you. Do you think that people like Walpole and authors consciously put symbology into their work, or that they just write a story and in the end it's like, oh, here's these, there's 3 drips of blood that came from the statue's nose, and that corresponds to, what is it, William of Orange? I was reading in this gradesaver.com. It was like Spark Notes.
Oh, really?
Yeah, to get some ideas. It's like, there's 3 drips of blood that come from the statue's nose, so that corresponds to William of Orange, because it was well known that his son got bloody noses, right?
Oh.
And Walpole would have known this because he was a Whig in Parliament.
Well, I mean, perhaps there would be a lot of symbology placed in, but I mean, on the other hand, I think a lot of writing is unconscious for people. Not unconscious. A lot of writing is subconscious, entering onto the page.
Here, I'll read it. As he spoke those words, 3 drops of blood fell from the nose of Alfonso's statue. This is on page 89. It says, this is one of the most memorable supernatural moments of the text due to its subtlety and strangeness. In fact, Walpole did not devise this scene entirely from his own imagination. It refers to the serious nosebleeds of James II that precluded his ability to respond to the threat of invasion by William of Orange in 1688. This ended up redirecting the royal bloodline, and as critic Nick Gloom writes, quote, "It is a reminder, therefore, of the historical destiny of the Whigs and the constitutional settlement of Protestantism in England. As a Whig and a Protestant, Walpole knew what he was alluding to with this unnerving scene."
Oh, okay.
Very, people seemed so much more intelligent back then, as I struggle to pronounce Protestantism. I don't know, that it seems though it's a direct allusion to the bloodline and Manfred being very conscious of.
I can see that more now that you've read that section, for sure.
Here's another, we were just talking about Matilda. Matilda, resigning herself patiently to her fate, acknowledged with looks of grateful love the zeal of Theodore. And it says, Matilda is a classic Gothic literary character, the damsel in distress. She is young, lovely, and excessively pious and virtuous. She swoons over the portrait of Alfonso and believes her destiny connected to his. She wants to be in love and married to a noble and handsome man. She has a conscience and a heightened moral compass and is always aware of how she acts and is perceived. Here, after she has been accidentally stabbed to death by the father who never loved her, she, quote, patiently resigns herself to her fate. She has no harsh words or regrets, no anger or despair. In fact, she manages to console the men in her life. She tells Theodore that she loves him, and she tells her father that she forgives him before expiring. Traditional gender roles are thus as much a hallmark of the genre as ghosts and prophecies are. Because Walpole was definitely a feminist.
That was so sad. Her character. Oh,
It is pretty sad.
so sad.
Do you connect with her character?
I suppose. I don't know. Maybe.
Resigned to your fate in a marriage?
Well, definitely there.
Yeah.
Absolutely.
Okay.
100%.
What, are we going on 4 years now?
Is it only 4?
Wow.
Well, I guess let's kind of talk about what we're going to talk about next.
In our next episode, we'll be talking about The Signal Man, which is a classic tale by Charles Dickens.
I'm so excited to talk about this one. I've never read it before. I never even really knew it existed. And Pat brought it up to me and said, we should do this one. We should talk about this one. And I started reading it and I found it to be so cool. Just such a cool idea. So I'm really excited to talk about it and to kind of delve into it a little bit and see what Pat thinks about it too.
Yeah. So our theme will be The Signal Man and Premonitions of Death. This is one we had planned to launch the show with, but there was so much content in the Castle of Otranto and so much to tie into just what Gothic horror is and setting that foundation for the rest of the podcast.
Absolutely.
I would beseech you all to subscribe to Unhallowed. You can do that on iTunes or any of your favorite podcatchers of choice. Just search Unhallowed. And you can also go to our website, visit us there at unhallowedpodcast.com. The best thing for you guys to do to help support the show would be to share it. Word of mouth recommendations is the most effective way. If you'd also go on and give us a rating and review on iTunes, that would really, really help us out. Otherwise, there is a support tab at unhallowedpodcast.com/support where you can find to support us in other ways, Patreon included. You could buy books that we've linked in the show notes page at unhallowedpodcast.com/the episode number. And you can get whatever we've been reading, you can get it there. And follow us on Goodreads. We have a lot of social media badges, Instagram and Twitter. And so we're very much willing to connect with you. Send us an email at unhallowedpodcast@gmail.com. And so that's about, all the ways that you can connect with us. It's quite a mouthful.
Oh, yeah.
But we have a presence on all those platforms. So go ahead, and the Signal Man is shorter, so it's not quite as much to read. And we've experimented a bit with the lengths, and we'll find that sweet spot. But we're really looking forward to bringing that to you, and we're really glad that you joined us for these episodes. Check us out in a week. This is the last pre-recorded show, and so the next show you hear will be after our launch of the podcast. So we're very excited.
Absolutely. Thanks for being here again. Thanks for listening and for being patient with us while we find our stride, so to speak. And I hope to speak with you. See you next time.